Good morning. Really glad to have another joint hearing today between House Education and House Ways and Means. We are joined today by folks who work throughout the field of public education, and we've asked them not to comment explicitly. We don't have any proposals on the table for anyone to comment on, and so they are not here to comment on specific proposals. But we're asked, what should we be thinking about, take into account as we dive deeper into the reform work that we're doing this year? Principles, key pieces of information, what the field needs of us. And so that's what we're doing here today. We will take a break halfway through. I think we have more people joining us on Zoom than originally anticipated, given much weathering happening, causing lots of things to happen in schools, Vermont, winter, etc. Okay. Any music?
No, thank you very much.
Great. With that then, Sue, would you like to join us? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the considerations and principles for education funding reform. My name is Sue Siglowski. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel for the Vermont School Boards Association. And with me today is Nicole Mace, who is a Winooski School Board member, and she's also the Vermont School Board Association's appointee to the Commission on the Future of Vermont Public Education. I'm going to testify first, and then Nicole will provide her insights after I testify. I have submitted a 2-page document which provides information about the VSBA, its members, vision, mission, and beliefs on the first page, and our legislative priorities on the second page. We reviewed this information with the House Education Committee in previous testimony, so I'm not going to repeat it again this morning. I am going to utilize the VSBA's education funding legislative priorities that are on the second page of that document. And my written testimony and the document that I'm referring to, the 2-page document, are posted on your website. I'm going to utilize the education funding legislative priorities in order to provide the committees with considerations for education funding reform. So I just want to start by saying that the VSBA understands that the education funding challenges Vermont is facing, and that we want to be a constructive partner in addressing those challenges with you. When looking at possible changes to education funding, the VSBA has laid out 6 priorities, and they're again on the second page of that 2-page document. The first is focus on students by providing sufficient funds to support equitable, sustainable, high-quality education in Vermont's school systems. The second is ensure predictability in the school district budget process. The third is give enough time for school districts to adjust to any changes. The fourth is provide data and modeling to show the impact on districts over time. Fifth, strengthen accountability for the use of public dollars. And sixth, include measures to address the cost drivers. Our testimony today will provide more details on each of these 6 priorities. And mainly, I'm going to be posing questions that the committee might want to think about. And I know that you have already asked a lot of very good questions. So first, focus on students by providing sufficient funds. We all know that adequacy of funding over time is critical to providing high quality education. So questions that we would ask when considering a change to Vermont's funding formula and sufficiency of funds, and again, these are in my written testimony. 1, does the formula provide enough funding to meet the actual cost of delivering high quality education with the current configuration of Vermont school districts and schools? 2, will the formula provide stable and predictable funding for school districts over time? 3, does the formula include mechanisms to reduce the impact of sudden economic downturns or fluctuations in enrollment? 4, is long-term sustainability built into the funding formula to ensure funding remains adequate and reliable over time? 5, does the funding formula plan for future cost increases such as inflation, rising costs of health benefits, and rising costs of tuition? 6, does the funding formula include the cost of tuition for districts that pay tuition, ensuring tuition increases at the high school level do not require reductions in spending at the elementary and middle school levels? 7, does the formula align with federal requirements, such as the Individuals with Disabilities Act? 8, does the formula include not only operational costs, but also capital expenses for improving and maintaining facilities? And then 9th, does the formula address technology infrastructure to support modern educational needs? So those are the questions we would ask under our first education funding priority. The second priority is ensuring predictability in the school district budget process. The regular review of consistent valid data is how school boards exercise their core oversight responsibilities, and it's also how Vermonters can determine whether their schools are upholding the commitment to public education for all Vermont students. The Agency of Education is expected to be the most trusted source of financial data related to Vermont education. Currently, the agency does not meet its minimum statutory responsibility to provide timely financial data that school boards need to build and adjust their budgets. The following are specific examples where financial data is insufficient or non-existent. Vermont currently has a shared financial model for funding public education. Therefore, data about both spending and student outcomes should be readily accessible. Measures like per pupil spending, staff to student ratios, capital spending, and much more are not available for easy comparison. Even the basic data that school boards need to determine the effects of budget decisions on taxpayers are provided very late in the budget process and change frequently. For example, education spending per long-term weighted average daily membership is used to calculate a district's tax rate. When that number, provided by the Agency of Education to each district, is provided late, changes frequently, or is erroneous, the uncertainty creates distrust. Questions we ask when considering a change to Vermont's funding formula and predictability in the school district budget process include: what changes will be made at the Agency of Education to ensure that the agency provides critical financial data to school districts in a timely and predictable manner? Second, what are the proposed changes in the timeline for developing, approving, and adopting school district budgets? 3, will changes in the timeline work with a fiscal year that ends on June 30th? And 4, how will the transition from the current timeline to any new proposed timeline affect school board elections and budget votes, most of which currently happen on town meeting day at the same time as municipal elections and budget votes? Moving on to our third education funding priority is give enough time for school districts to adjust to any changes. Moving to a new funding formula requires planning, coordination, and education. Moving to a foundation formula, as suggested by the governor, will affect Vermont school districts differently. For some districts, the introduction of a foundation formula may bring the opportunity for increased education spending. For other districts, the introduction of a foundation formula may reduce funding by millions of dollars, jeopardizing essential student programs. So the questions that we ask when considering the time frame are: can all of Vermont school districts adjust to a flip the switch approach to imposing a foundation formula without severe cuts? 2, should any governance changes come first before changing the funding formula? And 3, are there transition mechanisms the state could utilize to ensure essential student programs are not put at risk? Our next education funding priority is provide data and modeling to show the impact on districts over time. And I don't have any questions on this one. It's just critical that changes should not be made without data and modeling to show the impact of a new funding formula on districts over time. Moving on to strengthening accountability for the use of public dollars. We all know public school budgets are designed to be accountable and transparent in the use of public funds, ensuring that taxpayers can see how their money is being spent. School districts are required to follow strict state and federal regulations for financial reporting, and annual budgets are typically developed through a collaborative process involving school boards, district administrators, and community input. These budgets must be publicly presented, approved by elected school boards, and adopted by voters with detailed information made available to the public through budget meetings and reports. Public school districts undergo independent audits to ensure compliance with financial standards and publish financial statements to maintain transparency. This process provides accountability and transparency for the use of public dollars. Accountability and transparency is lacking for the use of Vermont's taxpayer dollars in private schools. When considering a proposed change in the education funding formula, questions we ask in this area include: 1, will public tuition still be paid to private schools? And if so, how will taxpayers be able to see how their money is being used in those schools? 2, what will the state require from private schools accepting public tuition in order to provide accountability and transparency for the use of public funds? And 3, how will the state ensure that public tuition to private schools complies with the compelled support clause of the Vermont Constitution? I'm getting to our last area, which is address the cost drivers. Changes to the funding formula will not be successful in reducing the cost of education without addressing the major cost drivers in school district budgets. One of the major drivers is the cost of public school employees' health benefits. The legislature could utilize the control it has by revising the statewide bargaining process for school employees' health care. We understand that this will be a difficult discussion, but putting it off will only make the problem worse. Through the current bargaining process, benefits have become so rich that school employees pay $0 in deductibles. These benefits are consuming a larger and larger portion of Vermont school budgets. In 2018, health benefits made up less than 10% of school budgets. Fast forward a few years, and it's now around 15%. If health benefits continue to grow at the current pattern, they will make up 20% of school budgets in a few years. To deal with this issue, school boards have to hold the line on the remaining parts of the budget. And the bottom line is healthcare is squeezing out other education initiatives. How will the state address the costs of these increasingly expensive benefits? Another major cost driver is school facilities. Many of Vermont's school buildings have reached the end of their useful life, as you all know, and the moratorium on state aid for school construction since 2008 has impacted school budgets. How will the state address the condition of school facilities in relation to funding changes? A more recent and very concerning cost driver is the increased need for student mental health supports so that students can access their education. Schools have taken on this expense as the need has grown. How will the state address the cost of mental health services and programs in relation to funding changes? And lastly, existing laws and regulations are cost drivers. Many of them were put into place without attention to how much pressure they would put on local school budgets. How will the state ensure that existing laws and regulations, such as Act 173 of 2018, are adequately funded? Getting near the end here, in addition to providing the considerations related to education funding priorities, I wanted to briefly highlight 3 of the Vermont School Board Association's core priorities. They do tie back into what we're talking about here. The first one is improve the capacity of the Agency of Education to meet its statutory responsibilities. Second, require the Agency of Education to expand and maintain a comprehensive data dashboard. And 3, restructure the State Board of Education. These were developed by a VSBA task force of school board members from across Vermont in response to longstanding challenges that have impacted districts' ability to realize their education goals, including their financial goals. In my written testimony, I'm providing a link to the full task force report. And there's, at the end of my written testimony on the last page, there's a summary checklist. If you don't have time to read the full report, I would encourage you to take a look at the summary checklist on the last page of my written testimony, because any proposed education funding changes are inextricably intertwined with the Agency of Education's ability to function and provide leadership, data, and support. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions or hand it over to Nicole Mace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. That task force report, I really appreciate you including the hyperlink because when it sort of came out in the middle of the fall, and I think a lot of members didn't get a chance to see it, and it really represents some very important, valuable work that you all did. So thank you. Any questions for Sue? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nicole, do you want to join us?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Nicole Mace, and I'm testifying today in my capacity as a school board member and the VSBA representative to the Commission on the Future of Public Education, though I'm not representing either my school board or the Commission in this testimony. Other roles that I've held relevant to this topic include serving as a general counsel and executive director of the VSBA during Act 46 and Act 173 implementation, serving as the Director of Finance and Operations at the Winooski School District during a large capital project in COVID, and now as a school board member during the implementation of Act 127. Based on this experience, I offer the following considerations as you embark on an effort to design a new education finance system for Vermont. First is to be mindful of the complexity, and I know you are, but I think it bears restating often. The complexity of the system and the interconnectedness of finance. Commission's first report highlights this complexity and emphasizes the need to be really clear about the intersection of these three policy areas. Changing the funding system alone, as Sue said earlier, will not lead to lower costs for Vermont taxpayers, but changing governance and finance at the same time significantly increases the complexity of the task. My recommendation is the legislature map out exactly how these two components of reform will work together and be implemented in order to mitigate any unintended consequences and also to ensure appropriate supports and resources are in place prior to implementation. Which will come first? How will the agency be staffed to support the field? Will consultants be available to districts to support implementation like they were throughout Act 46? My second recommendation is to understand what guardrails need to be in place to preserve equity. The Commission has received some of the same presentations that you have seen related to a foundation formula, and it appears to be a direction under serious consideration. As a school board member from a district that has a very unique population of students and whose tax capacity increased accordingly under Act 127, it is critical that gains made for high-need districts not be eroded by changes to the funding system. If we assume that funding changes will also come in the context of governance reform, how would a base foundation amount be calculated if Winooski is combined with neighboring districts? Would all students be treated the same? How would we ensure additional funding is actually going to multilingual learners in this context? How would decisions about whether to spend more than the foundation amount work? How would small communities with small voter populations be protected against being overruled by voters in the larger district? My third recommendation or observation is the need to preserve community connection to public education. My years at the VSBA taught me that Vermonters care deeply about their public schools, and students and families have strong connections to the community that they build around their school. If communities feel that decisions about funding, curriculum, and programs are being made without regard for their priorities, assets, and needs, support for our public schools will erode. It is important that through the process of reform, communities feel they have a voice and a stake in a reimagined public education system. At the same time, it's important that we find a balance between local and state decision-making and stay the course. Act 36 was structured to provide for local voice in the design of new districts through articles of agreement and local votes. Many, if not most, articles included provisions designed to make it very difficult to close schools. Larger governance structures in and of themselves will not save money. They can ensure equitable access to opportunities across small schools within a larger district, and I think we have seen progress there. The commission, we've heard calls to study Act 46 savings before even discussing governance. I question whether that's even possible, given the restrictions on school closures and articles of agreement, as well as the timing of full implementation of the act. COVID. Communities that were subjected to forced mergers under the law sued to block implementation, and the Vermont Supreme Court did not rule on the constitutionality of the law until July of 2020, when we were well into the pandemic. Post-ruling, some communities shifted their focus to decoupling mergers, and the governor and the legislature let them do it. So this sent a confusing message to the field. Did you mean it when you said we needed to create larger governance structures and achieve the outcomes of Act 46? To many, the answer appeared to be no. As a former administrator in a relatively small district with a high needs population, I've seen firsthand the incredible work our public schools do every day. I've also witnessed a strong institutional bias towards adding staff and resources to meet the growing needs of students. I believe there are opportunities within our schools to more effectively manage resources or repurpose them toward proven instructional strategies that would better serve students more cost effectively. The problem I've seen is that the incentives are all on the side of adding or maintaining staff and programs. Parents and advocates make a compelling case for doing more to meet unmet needs. The legislature adds new program requirements on an annual basis. Administrators and boards often face fierce backlash from students, staff, and community members when reductions in force are proposed. Many of us have seen what happens to school boards and communities when a contract is imposed, or when a decision is made to eliminate a popular service or program from a budget or close a school. All the hard decisions are left to local communities with very little support or backup from the state when the stuff hits the fan. These are very real dynamics that will have to be sorted through as part of your work. I appreciate very much the opportunity to share my perspective, and I'm hopeful the commission can serve as a place for ongoing review and engagement in the effort to improve the way we fund and deliver public education in Vermont. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I really appreciate how you are reminding us of some very strong lessons from our past that we should be carrying into this moment. Any questions from you? Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Jeff Bannon. Hello.
Hello. How are you? Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you a bit about Vermont and Ed's preliminary thoughts about Governor Scott's proposal to finance public education with a foundation formula. And I'll talk about some other things as well. For the record, my name is Jeff Bannon. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont NEA. And I would be remiss if I didn't start with a brief state of affairs in schools right now. Students are having difficulty recovering from the pandemic, and certainly younger students are in need of additional support services. This much is well known and reported. What is only becoming clear right now, as school budgets are being finalized in advance of town meeting day, is that there is likely to be between 300 and 400 layoffs of school staff if proposed budgets pass. So right now, we're anticipating 300 to 400 people will not be working in schools next year. School boards have proposed budgets that will have a significant impact on students and programs. And adding to this cut, the governor's proposed cut of the Universal School Meals Program is another blow to schools and students. The Universal School Meal Program is enormously popular with educators because it has removed the stigma from students and stopped schools and educators from being debt collectors. And we hope this awful proposal should be stopped, will be stopped, and that we don't think it should go back. We are still learning, however, about the governor's other proposal, the foundation formula. And what we have heard from the Colorado consultants and the Secretary of Education does give us pause. Of course, there's much we do not know, and we still have a lot of holes that need to be filled in. I'll start by saying a foundation formula is something many states and Vermont NEA's counterparts know and use with which to fund their schools. And what I've learned is, from chatting with my counterparts, and this isn't really surprising, and I think Sue touched on some of these, at the outset, the amount needs to be well thought out and realistic. Indeed, the governor's proposal would proposal would cut spending by $184 million. That's a lot of layoffs of school employees. That's a lot of employees. I reached that number by doing some simple math based on what I've heard. To ensure, excuse me, that's a lot of layoffs, and I estimate that's between about more than 3,000 jobs lost if you put this foundation formula as proposed into place. I did some simple math with that, and based on what I've heard, and that's a lot of jobs cut. But to ensure the number is adequate, the amount must be sufficient for every district. And we believe you and your JFO colleagues need to examine the amount to ensure it meets with Vermont standards for adequacy, not the out-of-state consultant's view of the world. It must have weights that capture this, that some students cost more to educate. It does, but this seems to be a case given we've heard yesterday and again, JFO needs to examine this. Examining the weights and the adequate amount is really critical. I know you've asked some tough questions. That's been great, but keep it up because there's a lot under the hood that we don't know yet, and your examination of this is really critical. There must be an inflator. My colleagues around the country say if you don't have the right inflation amount attached to it, it's meaningless. So you're constantly then chasing down. And what we know is if you don't use the inflator, what happens is services and programs for kids are cut. And so if there's an inflator that does not have teeth that bites back at the state, if you will, the biting will happen, the harm will be on student programs, and we don't think that's appropriate. If the state doesn't fund it for whatever reason, kids shouldn't suffer. There must be an equitable methodology for calculating taxpayer payments to private schools. So if it's the same, that as Sue pointed out, it shouldn't come out of the elementary school system. And that's what's happening now in a lot of places. Not knowing these details does make it a full assessment difficult, but we are engaged in learning more about this part of the governor's proposal. And that said, in what we know, the foundation formula doesn't lower taxes for anyone this year. And the apparent methodology to save $184 million is just by cutting staff. If true, this flies in the face of what we know. Kids need more services now, not less. What we know from last year, and I think it was Nicole Lee from the AOE testified in your committee Ways and Means last February, is that the annual year-over-year increase of mental health services onto the school budgets was $50 to $60 million. That's a silent shift from the general fund to the education fund that we should reverse, or at least have a general fund transfer to own up for it. The largest cost driver, and Sue mentioned this, is healthcare. However, the cost of healthcare is going up for educators too. It's not the statewide healthcare bargain that's the problem. We hear about that. Educators now paying 20% of their cost of health insurance. And that's what VSBA, VSA, VPA, and the governor saw it in 2017. So that 20% is ever increasing for school employees too. And we hear a lot of school support staff in particular, so-called work for healthcare, which is to say their take-home pay is minimal. Instead, please address the cost driver of that, which is the cost of hospital care. And as you may have seen recently, the Blue Cross Blue Shield letter from the CEO, Don George, they also believe that the problem is hospital cost. We believe there is a solution that other states have enacted, which you could consider, which is reference-based pricing. I know it's being discussed in other committees, but I believe there's an openness to this review, and we really want to support that. This would actually lower the cost for both sides, if you will, the school boards and the school employees, if we had reference-based pricing. And it's done that in other states, and it has worked. Additionally, Vermont Entity does have a proposal that would lower property taxes for 50,000 Vermont working class households right now. First, adjust the income sensitivity cliffs for inflation. It's long overdue and would save 50,000 households $50 million right now. Next, please evaluate what is coming out of the Ed Fund. As I noted earlier, mental health services are increased year over year, 50 to 60 million. Prior to 2018, the normal cost of teacher retirement was a general fund obligation. That number is now, I think, $35 million coming out of the Ed Fund. Since 1947 to 2018, that was a general fund obligation. And lastly, we think you should abolish the residential property tax and move to an income tax. I've said that innumerable times, but it's worth repeating. What we know in doing some examination of voters very much support their local schools. Overwhelmingly, they support their schools. What they also overwhelmingly rejected is how they pay for those schools. That's the property tax. It's the most hated tax in the state, as we all know. And moving to an income tax would be fair and in a much more equitable way to pay for education. We think you should move in that direction. Vermont schools are, in fact, doing an incredibly great job when it comes to educating students. Students are coming to schools with ever-increasing needs, and we just need to examine how we can do that better. Of course, we can, but kids are coming with needs that 20, 30 years ago, that was not part of the education system, and teachers are meeting that, but they're not school counselors, so schools are having to hire people to do that work. And it's tough. It's tough work, but they're doing it. They're up to the task. So I'm happy to answer any questions and stick around, or be around in the building in future days, tomorrow most likely, but couldn't be there today. And thank you for letting me testify via Zoom.
Thank you very much, Doug. And thanks to all your members for the work they do. Any questions? Such a quiet group today. Yes, Representative.
Jeff, thanks for coming in. Just a question. When you talk about 20% contribution to healthcare services for teachers, is that as a part of the premium? I mean, we heard previous testimony that it's $0 for deductibles. Can you expand on that just a minute?
Sure. That's so in 2017, Governor Scott, the School Boards Association, Superintendent Association, VPA, all wanted teachers to pay 20% of the premium. So that's what we're talking about. School support staff who were not yet at 20%, many teachers were, some were not. So that was an immediate move in 2018 when that law passed. So teachers are all paying 20%. School support staff, if they were above that, have been marching down towards 20% since then. And I think most, if not all, I think the average is around 18% last I looked. So they're marching towards 20% if they're not there. Most are, in fact. And that is of the premium. So it's not, and that's what everybody said in 2017 would save $26 million. The real cost driver is the cost of hospital care. That's ever escalating. Blue Cross said it in their letter 2 weeks ago. And that's the driver that my members are paying more and more and more. That 20% is ever escalating. And so that's the problem is it's not the premium copay or anything else. It's the cost of care that's driving up the cost of everybody's premium.
All right, thank you. Yep, helps.
Jeff, can you also talk about the out-of-pocket expenses that teachers and support staff pay?
Sure. I think maybe off on this. I think the question is whether it's first dollar or last dollar. And by agreement, it's last dollar. In other words, the incentive is make sure people get the care they need earlier without having the fear of cost keeping them out of primary care. We know that getting care earlier is cheaper and better in the long run. So if you give them a disincentive to get care earlier, they will avoid care. If you put it at the back end, which is what they've done, it's only then necessary when somebody really has critical care needs, but you don't dissuade them from going to get primary care earlier on, which everybody knows is cheaper. So it's the back end. The question is first dollar, last dollar, and it is the last dollar that's the concern that some people have. But it creates the incentive for people. The system right now creates an incentive for people, educators, to get care earlier, so that it's cheaper in the long run.
Can I have a follow-up question? Yes, please. I think earlier in the testimony we heard that teachers pay no dollars. So can you just expand on the out-of-pocket expenses related to the plan that most people gravitate to, and that we actually, I don't know if it's statewide, do we all have $1,000 as last dollar?
I don't know the exact number. I didn't prepare for the actual details of the plan, but I thought it was $500 last dollar. I'll double check that and get back to you on that. But it is last dollar, and that's the concern raised by some. The problem with putting it at first dollar is it creates a disincentive to get care, which then actually drives the cost up later. That's why you want people to get primary care earlier on to avoid higher cost care later on that is shared by everybody. So you remove the disincentive early on, and that creates not a barrier to getting care when you need it. It's not as if anybody's going to the hospital or a doctor because they just, it's Friday night or Saturday morning and they think, oh, this is a good time. I'll just utilize some care. That's the misnomer. It's actually the cost of care that's driving up healthcare.
Jeff, I just want to thank you for raising the difference between property tax burden and school spending. Because I think so often we talk about those things as if they're interchangeable. And my constituents certainly are very concerned about property tax costs. And, we're one of the highest tax municipalities in the state. But our per pupil spending is very low. And when you talk to my constituents, they're talking about how much more resources the schools actually need. They just can't afford to pay for it with property taxes anymore. And I just think that that's a very fine point that we have to keep in mind as we're going through this funding conversation. So I just wanted to thank you for raising that dynamic.
You're welcome. We know that the property tax is the hated tax, the residential property tax. And so that's why our proposal, among other reasons, we actually think it's a fairer, better way to go to the income tax. But moving right now to address the cliffs, the income sensitivity cliffs right now would save 50,000 households $50 million, and that's a sizable, tax relief for many, many people.
Jeff, can you talk about what you think about non-residential property tax? So property tax paid by businesses or second homeowners, where does that fall in your proposal for how we would restructure taxes?
Well, it's not part of it, but certainly we've talked in the past about the need to examine the non-residential rate. In other states, they have, multiple non-residential rates, I'll call it that. And we could do the same here. Should a business who's, employing people, providing service, if you will, to the community, pay the same as somebody who's got a third home, multiple home, and a vacation home, should their tax rates be the same? And I think the answer to that should be no. So you could separate the non-residential rate for businesses, for second and third homeowners, multiple homeowners, and other things that you saw fit to do. So I think that the non-residential rate should be examined as well.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you all.
Before we go to Jay, I'm wondering if Stu is still there because I have a question that came to me a moment ago. And I believe that Representative Holcomb does as well. Thank you, Stu, for hanging in with us. Sorry that we're not being very linear here. In the testimony you provided that you read out loud as well, you asked if there are transition mechanisms the state could utilize to ensure essential student programs are not at risk. I would love to hear examples or ideas for that if you have them, or if not, to get back to us with examples or ideas for that. I think it's an important part of this conversation.
Thank you. Yes, I don't have specific examples, but I am happy to try to find some for you, or come up with some ideas.
You. That would be fantastic. And Representative Holcomb.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought we were waiting until the end. I just wanted to ask you, because I understand that several districts have modeled the application of the proposed APA weights on funding in their local budgets. And I was wondering if you could speak to what they're finding, but also can you tell me if any districts have modeled using the AIR numbers and what they're seeing when they compare?
I don't have all of that specific information. I've heard from one district that did the modeling. I don't have the specifics of how they conducted the modeling, but what they were seeing was that they would need to do significant cuts. I think it was like $24 million over 2 years to their budget. And I can try to get information from other districts, but I don't have, sort of a sampling from around the state.
Two follow-ups. As a general strategy, we need some kind of transition plan. It appears the transition plan in the state is to fund at those levels and then maybe use one-time money to buy it down, as opposed to starting at a higher cost level and stepping it down as any savings are received. Do you have a comment on those two approaches to transitioning one way or the other?
The VSBA board is meeting on the proposal next week, and so I think I'll be able to provide more comments after that, but I don't have a comment on that currently. Sorry about that.
So, and just so folks know, I very specifically asked when we were preparing testimony for this to ask people that we do not need to comment on the proposals explicitly, given that there's so much still that needs to be shared and understood about the details of it, and the details matter so much. And so they really came to us with sort of considerations for reform rather than.
Can I ask one more consideration reform that is rooted in it's different. I mean, one thing we did see was an acknowledgement that when we have a scale issue, when students, for example, choose to go to CTE, it does sometimes impose a scale issue on the sending high school. And there was an acknowledgement of that by funding the high school with $5,200 for every CTE student who opts out. Are there other factors that reduce scale that we ought to be mindful of that are creating pressure, particularly for some of our rural high schools, that we need to keep in mind as we think about this? Given that apparently factors that erode scale are a challenge.
I'd love to be able to come back on that one as well, and give that some thought.
Thanks, Sue.
The record shows I live a lot further than Jeff Stanton and I live here.
We do not need to have a battle about how safe each of us are in our driving.
You're correct. I apologize. For the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director, Vermont Principals Association. The question you just asked, Sue, I just want to touch on that real
Can we
quick.
just give everyone a moment to pay attention to you?
Sorry, say that again?
We're still laughing.
He's still laughing.
The
That's
floor is
also a
yours.
good sign. For the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director, Vermont Principals Association. Before my 8 years in this current role, I was a principal and superintendent for over 20 years, serving in choice districts, non-choice districts, and as a superintendent within the same system. I also taught education and finance at the college level, and I tried to follow the directions I received, so I've decided to provide my testimony in a manner of bullet points, trying to focus mostly on the education and finance piece. I do want to touch on the question that was just asked Sue. Another example, that's early college. So we have a lot of rural high school principals that will tell you that their budget is hurting a lot because kids are availing themselves to the early college program, which we all started with good intentions. However, it's really the kids that were going to go to college anyway. And the kids that are left behind oftentimes end up in small classes or don't have as many offerings as they would have prior. So that is a concern. I just wanted to share that part before I forgot that. We don't know all the details of the governor's plan, so please take my comments with that understanding. And once we find out more, I'm sure my members and I will have more comments. So here's a few major highlight points for you to think about. First, do no harm. Don't rush into financial decisions without looking at potential unintended consequences. This should go without saying, and oftentimes political pressure to do something leads to rash decisions with long-term impacts. So please be careful. This is an opportunity, a huge opportunity for the state of Vermont. So we really need to make sure we do this right. And we should not be forced into any false constraints about how quick it needs to happen. Let's build a system that's sustainable, that still provides us with a high-class, world-class education, and let's do it in a thoughtful way. And if it takes us more than a couple of years, then that's okay. Equity is key. BPA, that's in our mission statement. Many foundation formulas in some states have actually contributed to disparity. That does happen across the country. The details do matter. If you have a foundation formula that's underfunded and you allow locals to raise more money on top of that, poorer districts are typically going to go with a minimal base amount, and wealthier districts will vote to spend more. I've talked to people in 17 or 18 other states that have foundation formulas that are in the same role that I'm in. So that leads to greater inequities. And one example, we have a couple principals that are Vermont principals now that were principals in Alaska. They said that their formula went without raising the base formula amount for something like 7 or 8 years in a row. It's one of the reasons they left the schools they were in. They were in schools that did not have oil. So they didn't have oil money to fall back on. And as a result, they could only fund the base amount, and they kept having to cut staff, and they finally decided to move to Vermont. Formulas that are looked at every legislative cycle can also be held hostage to the political whims of the day and, of course, the economic context of the times. A formula would need to have an appropriate base education amount, appropriate weighting for higher costs to educate students, and some type of inflationary index built into the law so that future general assemblies don't underfund public education. That'll be critical. There needs to be an index in there that helps us, whether it's a NEEP type of thing or some type of COLA, whatever it is. Do not decrease the amount of money going to school districts before fixing key cost drivers such as health insurance, unfunded mandates, scale, and governance issues. If you just lower the amount you spend in education funding without doing the hard work of making the necessary changes, you're simply going to cut programs and hurt schools and kids. I believe that is a fact. The idea that we could cut nearly $200 million from education funding without making any governance changes first is nonsensical to me. The only way you make those cuts is to cut personnel. That's the bottom line. When you cut personnel, especially without changing the governance associated to that, to move towards so-called right sizing, which I support, the problems are still there. The kids are still there. They still have the same issues, and there are less people and resources to support those issues. That should be a non-starter for us. It also concerns me that we may end up with a system in which there will be a basic education amount that may not really be enough to sufficiently fund the system, and then local districts will go out to voters for a levy or tax for a greater amount. To the degree possible, we need to meet the spirit of Brigham and ensure that the state is responsible for the education of all Vermont students. That means that our most vulnerable students and communities are protected. I think we also need to make sure that any base amount and weighting formula would apply to all schools, whether independent or public, if they are utilizing public monies. We currently have an inequitable system, and we should take steps to make sure it is as equitable as possible. Your job as a General Assembly is to, according to the Constitution and the Brigham decision, to support all Vermont students. And it's the job of the state to fund all Vermont students. So we need to do that in the fair and most equitable way possible. And then lastly, I'm going to try not to get on the soapbox, but how do we address the huge disparities in salaries across the state? I was a superintendent. I was a big supporter of Act 46. I sent Representative Conlin a copy of H883 the other day, which was a bill that I helped write with Joey Donovan and Peter Peltz at 2 Prospect Street. I was a superintendent. We worked very hard on that. Asked the House, didn't make it anywhere in the Senate. They would have taken all the districts, all the SUs in the state, made them into single districts. I still think that's the way to go. Maybe even combining some of those new districts, because I think the management of anything else is going to be untenable. As a superintendent, it took me so much work to get 6 towns on the same contract. I cannot imagine a district running from Middlebury to Richford with the difference in those contracts and trying to make that into one district. The people that are in those poor communities, those teachers are going to want to be paid the same amount as the teachers in the communities that have more resources. I think that's going to be an apple too big to bite off in the very beginning. And subject to any questions that you have, that's my testimony for today. Very quick. Welcome.
In your conversations with colleagues from other states, we heard from you and Jeff about an inflator or an inflation index built into the formula. Does that exist in other states that you have?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, it exists in Alaska. They just choose to not do it. So General Assembly can say, we don't have the money this year. And that is one of the concerns about a foundation formula. And, the reality is we do fund education different than anybody else. We are the one state that people locally say, this is what we need. Now state, you need to pay for it. And that is tough. And it's certainly worth having the conversation or whether we should change that and go to some type of foundation formula. But if we do that, let's make sure we put in some really strong safeguards so we don't gut public education like what has happened in a lot of other states. Thank you.
I really appreciate you bringing up the dilemma of early college. I work in one of those small schools where our senior class is like 2 kids on campus some years. And so I feel like not enough people are talking about what that's actually done to our small schools. So I'm wondering if you have a solution to that so that we can still maybe get the kids that need those or want those early college credits there, but keep our kids on campus.
I think what some schools have done is try to offer those courses on campus themselves. Up where I used to be superintendent, that's what we did. We had a couple of teachers that actually teach classes so the kids can take the classes and get college credit. And the 2 high schools that I had, Richford and Enosburg, have combined to do some schools to do that. So I think that's one way to do it. But I think we have to make a policy decision as a state. Do we want to be funding that? And if we do, that's fine. But what we're also saying is that the kids that are left over are probably not going to get as high a quality public education. That's just the reality.
No, I've taught English classes that have like 3 kids.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, Mr.
Yeah, thank you. I disagree. I'm gonna push back on the notion that the early college kids are kids that are gonna go to college anyway. Some of them are for certain, and we need to look at that. But there are other kids that don't have an early college experience, will never attend college whatsoever, and that's in nobody's best interest. So I just want to.
Yeah, the research hasn't shown us that so far.
Well, I could find you some.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. And I think we should do everything we can to help kids go to college if they want to go to college. It's not always the best pathway for every kid either. And we do have a lot of kids that we're paying for to go to college that would go anyway. That's all I'm saying.
I think there are quite a few different ways that, towards very clear and sometimes wonderful policy goals, we are, imbalancing our school.
Yeah.
And we need to do that work very much.
You're right.
Well intentioned.
And across.
Well intentioned, absolutely.
Well, first of all, just in terms of college exposure, we do have the dual enrollment program as well.
We do.
One of the issues I think that is the hardest is that in order to right size, we need fewer school buildings. If we are just combining SUs into SDs, but really keeping our current structure in place, that has proven to be a very difficult process to ask of school boards and to ask Frank, and we've made it basically impossible by having articles of agreement and all that. How do we address the ability to right size while maintaining much of what we currently have as our system?
So first of all, I'd get rid of articles of agreement. And small town people are gonna be, I know my email is gonna blow up. I just think that's where we're at. We got 80,000 kids. And we've gotta do something different. So I would have the boards the boards of authority would have the right to make decisions to close schools if they need to close schools. And then I would not just go with the SUs becoming SDs. That'd be a first step. And then I would look at what's an efficient number. I've always said 2,500 to 5,000. Now that's just based on national research. Maybe you could do more than that. Maybe you could do larger than that. I know Chelsea's done some research on, I think it's like 10,000. She can talk to you about that. Once you get above that, you start sometimes getting the diseconomy of scale in terms of achievement scores and results for kids. But we could certainly have these new smaller districts urged to join each other, especially if they had a board that could actually make decisions. And I think you see some decisions like some schools would close. Right now, a small school of 25, 30 kids can just say, no, we're not going to close. Our articles of agreement say we don't have to unless the community votes to. The rest of the district is held hostage. And that's hard. It's hard work.
Yeah, I would, having been in a position, I would say that it's still very hard to have a unpaid group of volunteers make that decision locally. And I don't have an answer. I'm not quite sure.
I mean, the General Assembly could do that too. Sure. General Assembly could say, these are the new districts. And they could say, we're going to make you all SDs and we're going to combine any town and every town SDs. You're going to now become all the town SDs. So you got 5,000 kids and this is the pathway to do that. General Assembly has the authority to do that. You give stuff to the municipalities. The school districts are basically municipalities. You can do the same thing with towns. You can say, we're not gonna have all these towns anymore. We're gonna have, that's a whole nother. Sorry.
All right, that is the hearing.
We're pretty much reminded that we can do whatever we want.
That's right.
Yes. You have a lot of authority.
You have the
there. You really
legal
do.
authority.
Yes.
Representative.
Yeah. So I think these are really hard conversations and, you know, if there are always things that we can impose, there are also things that communities can do locally. And I don't want to identify any regions, but I've had a couple of regions reach out to me. And what they're talking about is it's very hard to achieve scale if you're running two K-6s in different communities 4 miles apart. But that you can get some significant scale if you run a K, you know, a pre-K 3 and a 4 6. And actually people have colleagues, they have bigger staff sizes. And actually they've also found that when you provide pre-K in your building, people push them in because they like their local.
Absolutely.
And are you hearing people talk about that as well?
Yes,
Because
but
part of it is we have too much infrastructure, but part of it's we're not using our infrastructure well because we're spreading our kids out all over the
right,
universe.
but I think of at least 2 cases off the top of my head where principals and superintendents together have tried to do that and have been told no by their local communities.
Okay.
Because I don't want my 6-year-old being on the bus for 30 minutes.
Mhm.
I want her to go to the school that's in her neighborhood.
Yeah.
So that still is
It's
there.
real. It's real.
It's real, it is real.
But not all I mean, sometimes it's 10 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a lot to be said for if you've got a class of 3 kids or whatever,
Mhm.
kids don't learn that way well either.
Oh, I hate
You
it.
know, it's not a good experience.
If I could follow up on all that, and I realize we're supposed to talk about funding and not about
Right.
policy. Apologize very quickly. Now I've lost my train of thought. It was along those lines. We keep coming back in our committee, we're talking about class size minimums. And frankly, that's class size minimums.
Yeah.
Which really seems a tool to move in that direction, especially moving in the model that you're talking about, where maybe the school building number doesn't change, but the groupings of children within those school buildings can actually achieve the kind of scale that we'd like to see. That was a statement, not a question. Old rule.
Right.
Right, yeah, right?
It's a policy lever that you have control over that you could utilize.
Did you have something? No, it was just
Okay.
policy and funding are, I don't know, that we
Yes.
separate them, okay.
Yes, thank you.
But I'm sorry, but I have to perseverate this because I do, because it is about scale, right? It is about scale. And when you have schools that are sitting within 10 minutes of each other, that are competing for students based on class size, how do you get to scale? Because if you increase your scale, you lose students, that closes you. So how do we crack that nut?
I think the way you crack that nut, I think you already know the answer. I think it's bigger governance systems that are controlled by a board. It's just a question of what's that right size. And I think 5 is way too little. Maybe 52 is too many, and maybe we end up somewhere in the middle, we end up with 35 or 40 or something along those lines. And again, I think if you decide what are the parameters, maybe you say 2,000 to 5,000 or 2,500 to, or whatever, I think that would help guide you towards that work over time. But it's not going to be a simple answer. Last thing I forgot to say, mental health. I was talking to the executive director of Alabama, and I told the story a couple times. We were talking this last summer, and I was telling him about the money that, we spend on mental health and having therapists and stuff. And he goes, well, yeah, we do that in Alabama too. I said, well, it's such a draw on the ed fund. He goes, what are you talking about?
Right.
I said, well, we pay for it out of the ed fund. He goes, if you do, that's stupid. So we aren't comparing apples to oranges. When I talk to other people, they're like, no, we don't pay for mental health out of our ed fund. That's paid for out of the agency of human services budget. So just thought I'd share that.
Thank you, Representative.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'm just thinking that the way we educate students really has remained basically the same for a very long time. And with advances in technology and society and everything else, do you see there could be other ways of delivering education or educating students that's more efficient or different or better? Is there anything from your association where you've seen some of those where you could say really innovate deliveries?
A little bit through like Vermont virtual learning, things like that. I was a big Michael Horn follower, a big believer in disruptive innovation and stuff. And then we had the pandemic and we tried it, boy, did it fail miserably. So I think some people, if they're really motivated, older students, especially college students, can really learn a lot online. I think it's very difficult for younger kids not to have that face-to-face interaction from what we've seen and what the researchers showed us. They said during the pandemic, 6 or 7% of the kids actually benefited from going remote. What that means, like 93%. Yeah,
Didn't.
it's a great question.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What do you consider as unfunded mandates?
Well, I'll give you an example, and this is something I think you should keep doing. Just because it's unfunded doesn't mean I don't agree with it. Universal meals, perfect example. So you tell me I've got to provide universal meals, which I support, and I'm in a school where then I'm told I've got to make cuts. But I can't cut universal meals because that's a mandate that I have to do, so I cut a reading teacher instead. That's an example of an unfunded mandate. Anything that it doesn't have money associated with it, that you're telling me I have to do. Another good example of unfunded mandates, which
We do fund universal
Yeah,
schools.
that's not-
Well,
It's a funded mandate.
yeah, okay, all right. So that means that.
Can we do a new example?
Yeah, let me see. Well, I think a good example might be the HHB requirements that we have. We have more HHB requirements than any state that I know of. My members are spending so much time,
What's HHB?
hazing, harassment, bullying,
Thank
and the
you.
investigations that we have to do and all the things that our principals are required to do, take away time for them to actually be in the classroom providing instruction. So I think we had a list of 52 unfunded mandates when I was superintendent, that Brett Kay was our president at the time. He came to General Assembly and shared those and gave a big list, and I'm sure that Chelsea probably has a list somewhere that they could share with you of different things that are unfunded mandates.
Thank you.
A little bit of a follow-up to your question, Representative Kimball, and then another question for you, Jay. I think thinking about, none of this is really talking about how are we innovating, improving education, changing with the times, meeting where we are. One observation I have, and I think I've heard this from the field too, is that certainly as a teacher, I have felt this acutely since the pandemic, especially this sort of crisis mode operation from the pandemic to the sort of whiplash after it, to the political environment we live in, executive orders rolling out quickly in schools, is that and the instability of funding, and so much of our conversation being about funding, or what we're seeing on the ground, just staffing. Am I going to have enough people to open the building that day, or subs, or what am I combining? That we've lost instructional leadership. And I raise it only because I think that's particularly at your level. That's, in an ideal world, principals are truly instructional leaders and pushing and innovating. And I have certainly felt, and I'm about to hear from my superintendent, not because of, anything in that district, but because of the overall swirl we're in right now, that kind of instructional leadership, it's much more just sort of operations, emergency, sort of responding to things for a while now. And our instability at the state level around funding, I think, is part of that is limiting instructional leadership that is what's desperately needed to, how do we change, innovate, grow, respond to the times that we're in and the world kids are going into that's different than what most of the teachers who are teaching now, we're graduating into when they were in school.
Agreed.
Rhetorical question,
Yeah,
obviously, but
I will
I
say-
see that as a.
I will say our members are seeing on
Loss,
average, especially in the higher functioning systems, I'll word it that way. This year has been better than last year.
Yeah.
People are feeling a little bit more return to normalcy and stuff.
Yeah.
However, we have some systems that are constantly in flux, turning over superintendents and principals. And in those places, it's just putting out fires all the time.
But my second question was back to the sort of class size piece. And I think we talk a lot about, okay, a smaller school, a smaller rural school maybe, and a kindergarten class of 5, and that's not educationally sound. But I also wonder, and this is probably at the principal level too, how, if at all, through state policy to get at, I think sometimes what I see in high schools, particularly in our more populated areas, like in Chittenden County, is that you can have a lot of variation. Our averages, are sort of right where they should be. Our core classes are, but then you might have electives. Some of it you need to be able to offer some, choices, but if we're running classes of 5 or team talk classes of 12, or there's some lost efficiencies. And I don't want to be like on a treadmill that we're just about efficiency. So that's a whole decision of why you make to run a section or not. But I wonder what, either at the principal level and sort of decision making, or at the policy level and the state level, to bring that part into the conversation too, because I do think there's, some challenges within some of our larger schools, that there are pockets of really small classes that are, we maybe need to reconsider in terms of efficiency and scale and.
And those small classes tend to come in two forms in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
One is AP or higher level type courses.
Yeah.
Which, you're a lot of your high profile parents and community members are really gonna push for you to keep running those things.
Yeah.
And then there's on the other end, kids that need lots of extra resources,
Yeah.
often will be in small classes.
Yeah.
And so both are,
Yeah.
both are valid. I don't
Yeah.
have an answer to that. I think you have to do it on a case by case basis, but it's hard to say we're no longer gonna offer this AP course because then the school next door, or
Yeah.
if it's a choice situation, then kids are going over there. We can combine some of those resources. I used to have kids in Berkshire choose to go to Richford or Enosburg often because of one class or something along those lines. And one of the things I fought very hard for, finally we're able to combine those two into the district. Let the kids go back and forth in that situation when they're right next to each other. Let them get the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And I think you can do that in a smaller area. Pretty hard to do that if I have to drive from Richford to Middlebury.
Can't go there from here.
Thank you very much for
Very
joining us
welcome.
today. I hope your drive back.
Yeah.
Jeff Bannon doesn't care, but you guys do. I appreciate
Amy, do you mind if we take a 15-minute break before we hear from you? I know you have some time restrictions.
Works for me.
Okay, great, thanks. So we're gonna take a 15-minute break, folks. We'll be back here at